Welcome, story lovers. Subscribe to never miss a tale. Now let's start the story. Sit back and get comfortable. Picture this. You're a battle-hardened German soldier who's just spent 3 years conquering Europe. You've swept through Poland in 18 days, crushed France in 6 weeks, and pushed deep into the Soviet Union. Your officers have told you repeatedly that America is weak, divided, and on the verge of economic collapse. Then suddenly, you find yourself stepping off a train in rural Texas, and everything you've been told crumbles before your eyes. What you're about to discover isn't just another World War II story. This is the account of how nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war experienced something that would shake them to their very core. These weren't just any soldiers. These were veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps, men who had fought across the deserts of North Africa and earned the respect of their enemies through sheer military skill. They arrived in America expecting to find a nation barely holding itself together. Instead, they witnessed something that would fundamentally change their understanding of power, prosperity, and what a modern industrial society could achieve. The year was 1943, and the tide of war was turning against Nazi Germany. In Tunisia, the final collapse of German forces in North Africa had resulted in the surrender of over 250,000 Axis soldiers. Among them were some of Germany's most experienced desert fighters, men who had pushed British forces back to the gates of Egypt and had become legendary for their tactical brilliance. These soldiers had been indoctrinated with years of Nazi propaganda about American weakness and industrial inferiority. They were about to discover just how wrong their leaders had been. The journey began in the prison camps of Algeria, where American efficiency first started to crack German preconceptions. The organizational precision with which American forces processed thousands of prisoners daily exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had achieved, even at the height of its power. Medical examinations were completed with systematic thoroughness. Identity documents were photographed and filed with methodical accuracy. Geneva Convention rights were explained in fluent German by American officers who had been specifically trained for this moment. But perhaps most shocking of all was the food. German soldiers who had subsisted on increasingly meager rations during the final months of the North African campaign suddenly found themselves eating better as prisoners than they had as free soldiers. White bread appeared on their plates regularly. Real coffee, not the ersatz substitute they had grown accustomed to in Germany, was served at meals. Meat appear, a luxury that twice daily many had not experienced in months. This wasn't propaganda designed to impress them. This was simply the standard American military ration, distributed without fanfare or special ceremony. The Liberty ships that would carry them across the Atlantic represented their first glimpse of American industrial capacity. These vessels, which German prisoners would later learn were being produced at a rate of 3 per day, had been built in a matter of days rather than months. Each ship required 250,000 individual parts, assembled from components manufactured across 32 different states. The engines alone were marvels of mass production, built in separate factories and then assembled in ports that had barely existed 2 years earlier. During the 2-week Atlantic crossing, German prisoners witnessed something that defied their understanding of resource management. American sailors discarded more food waste each day than entire German companies had received in weekly rations. Half-eaten steaks were thrown overboard without a second thought. Whole loaves of bread that had sat too long were tossed into the ocean. Gallons of milk that had passed their peak freshness were poured down drains. This wasn't done to mock the prisoners or demonstrate superiority. It was simply the casual disposal of surplus in a system where abundance was taken for granted. The ships themselves became floating classrooms in American technological advancement. German prisoners discovered that the vessel carrying them was equipped with radar technology as standard equipment. This was technology that German military leaders believed only they possessed, and only in limited quantities for their most advanced warships. Yet here it was, spinning methodically above the bridge of what was essentially a cargo vessel, treating the detection of aircraft and ships as a routine navigational aid rather than a cutting-edge military secret. As the American coastline came into view, German prisoners pressed against portholes and crowded onto decks, straining to catch their first glimpse of the nation they had been told was weak and collapsing. What they saw instead was a shoreline dotted with massive industrial installations, their smokestacks reaching toward the sky like monuments to productive capacity. The Norfolk Naval Base alone sprawled across thousands of acres, its docks stretching for miles in both directions. Cranes moved with mechanical precision, loading and unloading dozens of ships simultaneously in a ballet of organized efficiency. In a single day, this one port handled more tonnage than the entire German port of Hamburg managed in a week. German prisoners who had worked in factories and shipyards before the war counted cargo ships in various stages of loading and unloading, their minds struggling to process the scale of the operation unfolding before them. Each crane lifted loads that would have required teams of men and horses in Germany, moving them with electric power that operated smoothly and continuously without the coal smoke that choked German industrial cities. The march from the ships to the waiting trains provided another revelation. Along the route, parking lots stretched as far as the eye could see, filled with civilian automobiles. Hundreds of them belonged to ordinary dock workers, men who performed manual labor, yet owned their own personal transportation. In Germany, private automobile ownership remained the privilege of wealthy elites and party officials. The Volkswagen, which had been promised to the German people since the mid-1930s, remained largely a propaganda dream, with fewer than 1,000 ever actually delivered to civilian buyers. But nothing could have prepared these battle-hardened veterans for the trains themselves. Instead of the boxcars they expected, or the cramped freight wagons that had transported German troops across Europe, they found themselves boarding full passenger coaches. These were Pullman cars with padded seats that converted into sleeping berths for overnight travel. Dining cars featured white tablecloths and silver cutlery. Observation cars offered panoramic windows designed for sightseeing rather than military transport. As one German officer would later write in his diary, they boarded these trains like tourists rather than prisoners of war. American guards seemed almost embarrassed by the level of comfort, with one sergeant actually apologizing that the air conditioning wasn't working properly in their car. Air conditioning in August. These German soldiers, who had endured the scorching heat of the North African desert without such luxuries, found themselves in climate-controlled comfort that they had believed existed only in Hitler's personal railway car. The 3-day journey from Norfolk to the prison camps of Texas and Oklahoma would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any military defeat these soldiers had experienced. As the trains rolled through Virginia, prisoners pressed their faces against windows, witnessing an America that contradicted everything their leaders had told them. Every small town blazed with electric illumination. Communities that in Germany would have been fortunate to possess a single electric street lamp displayed illuminated shop windows, electric signs, and houses with lights burning in multiple rooms simultaneously. The trains passed factories running night shifts, their windows glowing like beacons in the darkness. Parking lots remained full even at midnight, testament to round-the-clock industrial production. One German prisoner, whose father held a Nazi Party leadership position in Hamburg, would later write that they passed through dozens of cities during their first night of travel, and every single one possessed more electrical illumination than the entire city of Hamburg. When he challenged an American guard about this claim, suggesting it was impossible, the guard simply shrugged and told him he would see for himself. At railway stops, German prisoners observed American workers performing maintenance tasks with automated equipment and mechanized systems. What would have required 2 hours of manual labor in Germany was completed in 30 minutes through electric-powered coal loaders, automated water pumps, and mechanized lubrication systems. Every aspect of the operation demonstrated technological superiority that went far beyond military applications. This was civilian infrastructure operating at a level of efficiency that German military logistics had never achieved. The casual wealth displayed by American railway workers stunned prisoners who had grown up in a society where such luxuries were reserved for the elite. These workers wore leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They consumed Coca-Cola from glass bottles and discarded them without thought. They smoked cigarettes continuously, often stubbing them out half-finished, displaying a casualness toward valuable commodities that spoke of unlimited supply rather than careful rationing. As the trains crossed into Tennessee and Kentucky, German prisoners encountered American industrial power in its full majesty. Through their windows, they observed endless factories, each one larger than anything most had seen in their homeland. The aluminum plants of Tennessee stretched for miles along rivers, their electric furnaces consuming more power than entire German cities. These installations had been built during wartime, yet they operated with a scale and efficiency that dwarfed Germany's most ambitious industrial projects. The deeper the trains penetrated into the American heartland, the more complete became the destruction of Nazi propaganda about American weakness and industrial inferiority. These weren't desperate wartime measures or propaganda displays designed to impress prisoners. This was simply how America functioned, with an abundance so complete that waste became irrelevant, and efficiency was measured not in conservation, but in the speed of production and the scale of output. What these German prisoners were witnessing was the arsenal of democracy operating at full capacity, and they were beginning to understand that they had fundamentally misjudged the nation they had been fighting against. When the trains reached the Mississippi River, German prisoners witnessed something that redefined their understanding of agricultural abundance. Barges moved up and down the waterway like a constant parade of floating warehouses, each one carrying more grain than Germany imported in entire months. The prisoners watched in stunned silence as crane operators loaded these vessels with mechanical efficiency, moving quantities of wheat and corn that represented more food than many German regions had seen since before the war began. The grain elevators that lined the riverbanks stood like cathedral spires dedicated to agricultural surplus. Each towering structure could store enough wheat to feed a German city for months. Yet here they were scattered along the waterway as routine infrastructure. German farmers among the prisoners, men who had worked the land in Bavaria and Prussia, struggled to comprehend the scale of production these facilities represented. They had been told America was struggling to feed its own population while fighting a global war. Instead, they were witnessing agricultural capacity that could feed entire train crossed the mighty continents. In St. Louis, the Mississippi, on a bridge that itself demonstrated American engineering prowess, German prisoners who had expertise in construction and engineering marveled at the span's construction, but their attention was drawn to the cargo moving beneath them. River traffic flowed in both directions with clockwork precision, a testament to the logistical networks that kept American industry supplied with raw materials and finished goods moving to markets across the continent. As they traveled deeper into the heartland, the prisoners encountered something that challenged every assumption they had held about American society. In Kansas City, the train stopped at stockyards that stretched beyond the horizon, filled with tens of thousands of cattle awaiting processing. The smell of meatpacking plants filled the air for miles, an aromatic reminder of protein abundance that these German soldiers had not experienced since their civilian days before the war. German prisoners who had survived on minimal meat rations watched in amazement as American workers consumed beef sandwiches during their lunch breaks. These weren't special meals or celebratory feasts. This was everyday food for ordinary laborers. The casual consumption of meat that would have been treasured in wartime Germany spoke to a level of abundance that transcended anything these prisoners had imagined possible during wartime. The agricultural regions they passed through told an even more remarkable story. Endless fields of corn and wheat stretched to the horizon, each individual farm larger than entire German counties. The prisoners observed mechanized farming equipment that operated with a scale and efficiency that made German agricultural methods appear primitive by comparison. Single tractors performed work that would have required dozens of men and horses in the German countryside. At railway stations where the train stopped for fuel and water, German prisoners watched American farmers conduct business with casual confidence that spoke to economic prosperity rather than wartime desperation. These men drove their own trucks, wore clothing that suggested comfort rather than rationing, and discussed crop yields that would have been considered fantasy in Germany. The contrast between American agricultural abundance and German wartime scarcity became more pronounced with each mile traveled. The industrial installations they passed grew larger and more impressive as the trains moved westward. Near Detroit, prisoners caught glimpses of automotive factories that had been converted to military production. These plants operated around the clock, their parking lots filled with workers' automobiles even during night shifts. The irony was inescapable. German soldiers were being transported as prisoners through a landscape where factory workers owned personal transportation that German officers could rarely afford. The Willow Run plant, visible from miles away due to its sheer size, represented something unprecedented in industrial history. German prisoners learned from their guards that this single facility produced a heavy bomber every hour. The numbers seemed impossible until they witnessed the operation firsthand. Assembly lines moved with mechanical precision, workers operated with practiced efficiency, and completed aircraft rolled out of the factory with the regularity of consumer goods, rather than complex military equipment. German prisoners who had worked in aircraft factories before the war understood the implications immediately. They had labored in facilities where producing a single aircraft required weeks of careful assembly. Here, American workers were achieving production rates that defied everything these prisoners understood about manufacturing complexity. The quality of construction was evident even from a distance, dispelling any notion that American aircraft were hastily built or inferior products. The psychological impact of these observations began manifesting among the prisoners during their journey. Men who had entered captivity with confidence in German technical superiority found themselves questioning everything they had been told about American industrial capacity. Conversations in the railway cars shifted from defiant nationalism to confused attempts to reconcile what they were seeing with what their leaders had taught them. Some prisoners began keeping secret diaries, documenting observations that contradicted years of Nazi propaganda. They wrote about electric lights that burned continuously without concern for fuel conservation. They described waste that would have been criminal in resource-starved Germany, but was treated as normal overflow in American abundance. They recorded their growing realization that they had fundamentally misjudged the nation they had been fighting. The trains passed through Oklahoma oil fields, where derricks dotted the landscape like mechanical forests. German prisoners observed petroleum production on a scale that dwarfed anything in their homeland. These installations operated continuously, extracting and refining oil with industrial efficiency that supported not only American military operations, but also maintained civilian consumption at levels that seemed impossible during wartime. The casual abundance extended to everyday consumer goods that German civilians had not seen for years. At railway stations, prisoners observed American civilians purchasing items from vending machines with coins, treating candy bars and soft drinks as routine purchases rather than luxury items. The contrast with German rationing systems could not have been more stark. Where German civilians waited in lines for meager allocations of basic necessities, Americans consumed treats and conveniences without apparent concern for scarcity. As the trains approached Texas, German prisoners encountered their final revelation about American agricultural productivity. Cotton fields stretched endlessly under the vast sky, tended by mechanical equipment that operated with efficiency unknown in German farming. The scale of cultivation suggested agricultural surplus rather than subsistence production. another indication that America was fighting a global war from a position of abundance rather than desperation. The processing facilities they observed reinforced this impression of overwhelming productive capacity. Cotton gins, grain mills, and food processing plants operated with mechanized efficiency that transformed raw materials into finished goods at rates that exceeded anything these German prisoners had witnessed in their homeland. American industrial capacity wasn't just meeting wartime demands, it was exceeding them while maintaining civilian prosperity. When the trains finally Texas and Oklahoma, German prisoners arrived at their destinations and onto platforms with their worldview fundamentally shaken. The journey across America had accomplished something that military defeat could not achieve. It had demonstrated through direct observation that Nazi propaganda about American weakness was not merely incorrect, but catastrophically wrong. These battle-hardened veterans, who had conquered much of Europe through military skill and ideological conviction, now faced the realization that they had been fighting a nation whose industrial capacity exceeded their wildest imagination. The America they had been told was weak and collapsing was actually the most powerful industrial force the world had ever seen. The prison camps awaiting them would provide even more profound revelations about American society and values, but the transformation had already begun during their transcontinental journey. German soldiers who had boarded trains as convinced Nazis were arriving at their destinations as men whose fundamental assumptions about the world had been shattered by the simple act of witnessing American abundance firsthand. The prison camps themselves represented another level of shock that these German veterans were completely unprepared for. Camp Hearn in Texas, constructed in just 4 months, housed thousands of prisoners in conditions that exceeded what most had known as civilians in Germany. These weren't the brutal detention facilities that Nazi propaganda had conditioned them to expect from their enemies. Instead, they found wooden barracks equipped with electric lighting, flush toilets, hot showers, and steam heating systems. Each building had been constructed using more lumber than entire German villages possessed. The electric infrastructure alone represented a level of resource allocation that seemed impossible to prisoners who had lived through years of German wartime rationing. Light switches operated reliably, providing illumination whenever needed, rather than being restricted to essential hours. Hot water flowed from taps without limitation, a luxury that many German civilians had not experienced since before the war began. The camp hospital presented perhaps the most profound contradiction to everything these prisoners had been taught about American society. German medical personnel among the prisoners found themselves in a facility better equipped than most civilian hospitals in their homeland. X-ray machines operated with the latest technology. Surgical equipment surpassed anything available in German military hospitals. Pharmaceutical supplies included medications that had been unavailable in Germany since the early war years. Most shocking of all was the presence of penicillin, the miracle drug that German prisoners had only heard whispered about in rumors. American medical staff used it freely, even treating minor infections among enemy prisoners with medicine that could have saved German soldiers' lives if it had been available. The casual distribution of such advanced medical treatment to captured enemies revealed a level of resource abundance that transcended anything these prisoners could have imagined. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, a German military surgeon captured with the Afrika Korps, found himself working alongside American medical personnel who shared their knowledge without reservation. They taught him new surgical techniques, demonstrated advanced equipment, and provided him with medical journals containing research that was years ahead of German developments. This generosity toward an enemy physician contradicted every assumption about American character that Nazi ideology had instilled. The camp kitchens became another source of profound psychological impact. German prisoners assigned to food preparation duties discovered walk-in refrigerators larger than most German family homes. Electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges capable of preparing meals for thousands operated with mechanical efficiency that exceeded anything in German institutional cooking. The daily food allocation included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread in quantities that German civilians had not seen since the late 1930s. Perhaps most disturbing to German sensibilities was the systematic waste that American regulations required. Camp procedures mandated preparing 10% more food than needed to ensure every prisoner received full portions. The surplus was discarded daily, not because it was spoiled or contaminated, but simply because regulations prioritized abundance over conservation. German prisoners found themselves throwing away perfectly good bread, meat, and vegetables while knowing their families in Germany were surviving on subsistence rations. Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, documented his emotional breakdown while disposing of food that represented more nutrition than his family had seen in months. The psychological trauma of waste in the face of known hunger back home created a cognitive dissonance that shattered his understanding of wartime resource management. This wasn't propaganda designed to demoralize prisoners. It was simply how American logistics operated, with surplus built into every calculation. By September 1943, labor shortages in American agriculture led to employment programs that would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any propaganda campaign. German prisoners were transported daily to work sites throughout the American heartland, traveling through rural communities without blindfolds or restricted routes. They witnessed everything American society had to offer, and what they saw contradicted every element of Nazi teaching about American weakness and social decay. In the cotton fields outside Houston, prisoners operated alongside mechanical equipment that processed more raw material in single hours than entire German villages could handle in months. The cotton gins were powered by electricity from rural electrification programs that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by the early 1940s. German prisoners discovered that the farmer who owned this operation wasn't aristocracy or political elite, but simply an ordinary American who possessed electricity, running water, multiple vehicles, and agricultural equipment, worth more than most German families earned in lifetimes. The mechanization extended to every aspect of American agriculture. In Nebraska, sugar beet fields, prisoners witnessed combine harvesters that performed the work of hundreds of men. These machines operated across fields that stretched beyond the horizon, each individual farm larger than entire German counties. The yields discussed casually by American farmers would have been considered impossible fantasy in German agricultural planning. 60 bushels of wheat per acre compared to Germany's 30 bushels on the best available land. German prisoners working on a farm outside Scottsbluff encountered a 16-year-old American boy driving a tractor worth more than everything his father had accumulated over a lifetime of labor. When the prisoner mentioned this disparity, the teenager laughed and explained that his father was actually waiting for delivery of an even better model from John Deere. This casual attitude toward agricultural equipment that represented vast wealth by German standards revealed an economy operating at levels these prisoners had never imagined possible. The most devastating revelations came to those prisoners who worked near American manufacturing facilities. While Geneva Convention restrictions prevented direct involvement in war production, prisoners could work in industries that freed American workers for military manufacturing. This technicality allowed thousands of German soldiers to witness American industrial capacity operating at full wartime production levels. At a Campbell's soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners observed production lines processing more tomatoes in single days than most German food processing plants handled in entire months. The facility operated with skeleton crews of women and elderly men, as most young workers had been deployed to military service. Yet production exceeded peacetime levels through mechanization and efficiency that German industrial planners had never achieved even with full workforces and unlimited resources. Everything was automated beyond German comprehension. Electric conveyor belts moved products through processing stages without human intervention. Automatic filling machines sealed hundreds of cans simultaneously. Steam cookers processed vast quantities with precision that eliminated human error while maximizing throughput. One elderly American woman monitored control systems that managed production requiring 50 workers in comparable German facilities. She performed these duties while listening to radio entertainment and drinking coffee, treating complex industrial management as routine work rather than demanding technical specialization. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal at power plants gained glimpses of the automotive industry's conversion to military production. The River Rouge complex employed over 100,000 workers producing jeeps, aircraft engines, and tanks around the clock. The facility consumed more electricity daily than the entire city of Hamburg, yet operated as one component in a vast network of similar installations across American industrial regions. The parking lots surrounding these facilities told their own story of American prosperity. Thousands of automobiles belonged to factory workers, men and women performing manual labor, yet owning personal transportation that German officers rarely possessed. German prisoners learned that many American workers owned multiple vehicles, using one for work commutes and keeping another for family transportation. This level of consumer wealth among the working class contradicted everything Nazi ideology had taught about American social structure and economic distribution. By winter 1943, American intelligence officers documented what they termed ideological collapse syndrome among German prisoners. The cumulative impact of witnessing American abundance was producing psychological transformation that exceeded the effects of military defeat. Prisoners who had arrived as fanatical supporters of Nazi ideology were requesting access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials with increasing frequency. The camp newspapers produced by prisoners themselves began reflecting this ideological shift. Publications that had initially maintained defiant nationalism gradually evolved into discussions of democratic governance, market economics, and post-war reconstruction possibilities. German editors found their audiences increasingly receptive to ideas about political systems based on individual freedom rather than state control. Lieutenant Hermann Goetz, captured with the Afrika Korps, wrote letters that passed American censorship describing his growing realization that Nazi propaganda had been systematically dishonest. He documented witnessing the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth, contradicting everything he had been taught about American weakness and social division. His correspondence revealed a man whose fundamental worldview was being reconstructed through daily observation of American society functioning at peak efficiency while treating enemies with dignity. The treatment of Italian prisoners after Italy's surrender in September 1943 provided another devastating blow to Nazi racial theories. Italian soldiers who agreed to cooperate with American forces were formed into service units with improved quarters, increased wages, and expanded freedoms. German prisoners watched their former allies working alongside Americans, eating in American restaurants, and some even developing romantic relationships with American women. This generous treatment of former enemies who had switched sides contradicted Nazi teachings about American vindictiveness and racial hatred. German prisoners observed that Americans distinguished between enemy governments and enemy peoples, showing mercy toward individuals while maintaining military objectives against hostile regimes. This nuanced approach to warfare revealed a sophisticated understanding of conflict that Nazi ideology had never acknowledged or prepared these prisoners to recognize. Christmas 1943 provided the most profound psychological impact of their captivity. American organizations, churches, and civic groups sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners, men who had been attempting to kill American soldiers just months earlier. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. Local communities invited prisoners to Christmas dinners, though regulations prevented most from accepting these gestures of goodwill. The kindness demonstrated by American civilians toward enemy soldiers shattered the final remnants of Nazi racial theory. These were people whose sons and husbands were fighting against German armies. yet they showed genuine Christian charity rather than hatred or desire for revenge. German prisoners struggled to comprehend such treatment from a population that had every reason to despise them. The Christmas feast itself defied everything these prisoners understood about wartime resource allocation. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, and ice cream appeared on tables in quantities that Germany had not seen since before World War I. American guards explained that this represented normal holiday celebration for American families, not special treatment designed to impress prisoners. German soldiers ate until physical discomfort prevented further consumption, unable to process such abundance being lavished on captured enemies. They had witnessed American prosperity firsthand, but experiencing it personally through generous treatment created emotional responses that purely intellectual observations could not achieve. These men began understanding that they had been fighting a nation whose power derived not from military conquest, but from productive capacity and social cohesion. By early 1944, over 40,000 German prisoners had enrolled in educational programs offered through American universities and cultural institutions. They studied English language, American history, mathematics, and sciences through correspondence courses provided by institutions like the University of Chicago and Stanford University. The hunger for knowledge was insatiable among men who had discovered that everything they had been taught about their enemies was systematically false. German prisoners who had been told Americans were cultureless barbarians found themselves accessing libraries containing millions of books, universities that welcomed students from all social backgrounds, and scientific research that led global development in multiple fields. They read American newspapers freely, comparing multiple viewpoints on political issues, something impossible under Nazi censorship in Germany. The camp theaters showed regular Hollywood productions rather than propaganda films, allowing prisoners to observe American culture expressing itself through entertainment rather than political indoctrination. They watched films depicting American defeats and recoveries, amazed that a nation would show such self-criticism to enemies. This cultural confidence revealed a society secure enough in its strength to acknowledge weaknesses while maintaining overall cohesion and purpose. Spring 1944 brought expanded labor programs as American production reached wartime peaks. German prisoners worked in canneries, lumber mills, and fabrication plants, witnessing industrial capacity that made previous observations seem modest by comparison. At the Higgins Boat Factory in New Orleans, prisoners watched workers assembling 700 landing craft monthly, each vessel requiring 20,000 individual components manufactured by subcontractors across the American industrial network. The scale of coordination required for such production exceeded anything German industrial planning had achieved. 1,500 separate suppliers delivered components that assembled into complex military equipment with precision that eliminated delays or quality failures. 20,000 workers, including thousands of women operating cranes and welding equipment, maintained production schedules that German planners would have considered impossible, even under optimal conditions. At Republic Steel in Ohio, prisoners witnessed daily production of 10,000 tons of steel from blast furnaces that operated continuously. Endless trains delivered iron ore from Minnesota and coal from Pennsylvania in a logistical network that supplied raw materials faster than the facility could process them. This single plant produced more steel than the entire Ruhr Valley at its peak efficiency, yet operated as one component in a vast network of similar installations across American industrial regions. German prisoners who had worked in steel production before the war documented their amazement at American industrial methods. They had understood manufacturing in terms of careful resource conservation and maximum utilization of available materials. American production operated on principles of overwhelming abundance, where efficiency was measured by output volume rather than input conservation. The summer harvest of 1944 provided final demolition of any about American agricultural weakness remaining Nazi propaganda. German prisoners worked across Midwest farming regions, witnessing food production that could sustain global populations. In Kansas wheat fields, single farms produced more grain than entire German provinces. Mechanical harvesters moved across landscapes like ships navigating oceans of gold, each machine processing hundreds of acres daily. The grain elevators they filled could store more wheat than Germany imported annually. Yet these facilities represented routine infrastructure rather than strategic reserves. American farmers discussed crop yields and market prices with casual confidence that revealed an economy operating far beyond subsistence levels. They could afford to lose significant portions of their harvest without affecting national food security, a concept that caused psychological breakdown among prisoners from hunger-ravaged Germany. In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards extending beyond visual horizons. They watched perfectly acceptable fruit being discarded for minor cosmetic imperfections, produce that would have been treasured in Germany regardless of appearance. Entire crops were sometimes destroyed to maintain market prices, economic policies that prisoners from resource-scarce Germany could not comprehend. The systematic destruction of surplus food, while German families survived on subsistence rations, created cognitive dissonance that completed the psychological transformation of Nazi ideology. These prisoners understood that they had been fighting a nation whose productive capacity exceeded their ability to consume its own output, even while supplying military forces on multiple continents and supporting allied nations with material aid. When news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps in June 1944, German prisoners experienced their final ideological collapse. The scale of the operation, involving 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men in the initial assault, demonstrated organizational capacity beyond anything Nazi Germany had attempted or achieved. Prisoners watched newsreels of the invasion within days of the operation, observing endless streams of vessels, artificial harbors constructed from prefabricated components, and supply systems delivering 15,000 tons of equipment daily across open beaches. They witnessed their homeland being systematically conquered by the very nation they had been taught was too weak and disorganized to mount effective military operations. The psychological impact was complete and irreversible. German soldiers who had entered American captivity as convinced supporters of Nazi ideology now understood that they had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with inadequate resources and false assumptions. They had sent cavalry against mechanized divisions, rifles against automatic weapons, and ideological conviction against unlimited productive capacity. The transformation was about to become even more profound as these prisoners began experiencing something that would challenge Nazi racial theories more than material abundance ever could. They were about to discover American humanity in action, and that revelation would complete their journey from enemy soldiers to future democratic citizens. Throughout their captivity, German prisoners encountered something that shattered Nazi racial ideology more completely than any material demonstration of American power. They discovered a level of human decency that contradicted everything they had been taught about their enemies. When news arrived that a prisoner's family member had died in Allied bombing raids, American camp commanders personally delivered Red Cross messages and offered genuine condolences. These weren't propaganda gestures designed to win hearts and minds. They were expressions of basic human compassion toward men whose armies were actively fighting American forces. The medical treatment provided to German prisoners particularly challenged their preconceptions about American character. German doctors found themselves working alongside American medical staff, not as subordinates or prisoners, but as colleagues sharing knowledge and techniques. They gained access to advanced surgical equipment and pharmaceutical supplies that surpassed anything available in German military hospitals. When prisoners required complex operations, American surgeons performed procedures that would have been available only to Nazi Party elites in Germany. Mental health treatment, virtually unknown in German military culture, was provided to traumatized soldiers without judgment or punishment. Prisoners suffering psychological breakdown received counseling. Rather attempted suicide were treated with therapy in STIA than discipline. Those who had court-martial proceedings. This approach to human suffering revealed a society that valued individual dignity even among enemies, a concept that Nazi ideology had systematically rejected. The educational opportunities offered to German prisoners exceeded anything most had experienced as civilians. Universities across America provided correspondence courses in subjects ranging from agriculture to atomic physics. The University of Chicago sent professors to lecture on democratic governance and economic theory. Stanford University offered advanced scientific education to men who had been told that American universities were inferior institutions dominated by racial minorities and communist sympathizers. The thirst for knowledge among German prisoners proved insatiable once they realized that American educational institutions actually led global development in multiple fields. Men who had been taught that Americans were intellectual inferiors discovered libraries containing millions of volumes, research facilities that advanced human understanding, and academic freedom that allowed open debate on controversial topics. They studied subjects that had been forbidden in Nazi Germany, examining multiple perspectives on political and social questions. Camp theaters regularly showed Hollywood films that revealed American culture expressing itself through entertainment rather than political indoctrination. German prisoners watched movies depicting American military defeats, social problems, and political conflicts with amazement that a nation would display such self-criticism to enemies. This cultural confidence suggested a society secure enough in its strength to acknowledge weaknesses while maintaining overall unity and purpose. The films themselves contradicted Nazi propaganda about American cultural inferiority. Production values exceeded anything German cinema had achieved. Storytelling demonstrated sophisticated narrative techniques, and technical innovation revealed advances in cinematography and sound recording that German filmmakers had not approached. These weren't crude propaganda pieces, but complex artistic expressions that treated audiences as intelligent participants rather than passive recipients of ideology. American newspapers provided to prisoners offered another revelation about democratic society functioning through open debate rather than centralized control. Multiple publications presented different viewpoints on the same events, allowing readers to form independent judgments rather than accepting official interpretations. Editorial criticism of government policies appeared alongside supportive commentary, creating a marketplace of ideas that Nazi censorship had made impossible in Germany. German prisoners compared these diverse perspectives with the monolithic propaganda they had received in their homeland. Recognizing for the first time how severely their information had been restricted and manipulated, they discovered that American criticism of government actions was considered patriotic rather than treasonous, that questioning official policies strengthened democracy rather than weakening it. By spring 1944, the secret re-education program administered by American intelligence had produced remarkable results that exceeded all expectations. Over 25,000 German prisoners had voluntarily enrolled in courses about democratic governance, constitutional law, and free market economics. Camp newspapers evolved from defiant nationalism to sophisticated discussions of post-war reconstruction possibilities. Discussion groups debated Germany's future political system with enthusiasm that surprised American observers. The transformation wasn't achieved through coercion or forced indoctrination, but through simple observation of American society functioning at peak efficiency while maintaining individual freedoms. Prisoners witnessed ordinary citizens living better lives than German aristocracy had enjoyed. Workers owning property and making independent decisions about their futures, and minorities participating in economic and social advancement that Nazi racial theory claimed was impossible. German officers who had sworn personal oaths to Adolf Hitler found themselves writing essays about implementing American agricultural methods in post-war Germany. soldiers who had fought to establish Nazi racial supremacy across Europe began planning how to introduce democratic institutions to their defeated homeland. The ideological conversion was so complete that American authorities worried about prisoners becoming overly enthusiastic about American political and economic systems. Some prisoners requested permission to remain in America after the war ended, preferring life in a nation that had shown them dignity and opportunity to returning to a Germany they now recognized as morally and materially bankrupt. Others established correspondence relationships with American families, developing friendships that would continue for decades after their repatriation. Marriage proposals between German prisoners and American women occurred frequently enough to require official regulations governing such relationships. The agricultural work programs provided German prisoners with practical education in farming methods that achieved yields they had previously considered impossible. American farmers casually discussed production levels that would have been fantasy in German agricultural planning. 60 bushels of wheat per acre compared to Germany's 30 bushels on optimal land. Corn harvests that exceeded German grain production across entire regions. Mechanization that allowed single operators to cultivate areas requiring dozens of workers in traditional European farming. German prisoners working on American farms witnessed agricultural abundance that extended far beyond basic food production. Livestock operations maintained cattle herds larger than entire German provinces possessed. Dairy production provided fresh milk, cheese, and butter in quantities that German civilians had not seen since the early years of the century. Poultry farms operated on industrial scales that supplied eggs and meat to regional markets without rationing or shortages. The casual waste of agricultural products continued to traumatize prisoners whose families survived on subsistence rations in Germany. They watched perfectly good produce being discarded for minor cosmetic imperfections. Livestock feed, consisting of grain that would have sustained human populations in their homeland, and surplus crops destroyed to maintain market prices, rather than donated to hungry populations overseas. American farmers treated this abundance as routine rather than exceptional, discussing weather conditions and market fluctuations with the confidence of men whose productive capacity far exceeded survival needs. They owned multiple vehicles, modern farm equipment worth more than entire German villages possessed, and homes equipped with conveniences that German urban elite rarely enjoyed. The mechanization extended to every aspect of agricultural production. Tractors performed cultivation work that required teams of horses in Germany. Combine harvesters processed grain faster than traditional methods could achieve with unlimited manual labor. Irrigation systems delivered water with precision that maximized crop yields while minimizing human effort. Storage facilities preserved harvests with technology that prevented spoilage and maintained quality for extended periods. German prisoners documented their observations in letters that passed American censorship, describing farming operations that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had claimed about American agricultural weakness. They wrote about visiting farms larger than German counties, operated by families rather than collective organizations, producing food for global markets rather than struggling to meet local needs. Industrial work assignments provided German prisoners with direct experience of American manufacturing capacity, operating at wartime peak efficiency. At aircraft factories, they witnessed production lines assembling complex military equipment with precision and speed that German industrial planners had never achieved. Single facilities produced more aircraft monthly than German factories completed annually, using assembly techniques that maximized quality while minimizing production time. The coordination required for such manufacturing exceeded anything German industry had accomplished even during peacetime operations. Thousands of subcontractors delivered components according to precise schedules that eliminated delays and waste. Quality control systems ensured that every finished product met specifications without requiring extensive inspection or rework. Worker productivity achieved levels that German managers had considered impossible under any circumstances. women operated heavy machinery, managed complex production processes, and supervised technical operations with competence that contradicted Nazi ideology about gender roles and capabilities. African American workers performed skilled tasks and earned wages that exceeded what most German workers received, destroying racial theories that had justified Nazi persecution policies. Teenage employees operated sophisticated equipment while attending educational programs that prepared them for advancement opportunities. The integration of diverse populations in American industrial production demonstrated social cooperation that Nazi ideology claimed was impossible in racially mixed societies. German prisoners observed harmonious workplace relationships between ethnic groups that Nazi propaganda had described as natural enemies. Production efficiency actually benefited from diversity of perspectives and skills, rather than suffering from supposed racial conflicts. American workers complained about overtime requirements while producing quantities that German factories could not achieve with slave labor and extended shifts. They took coffee breaks, listened to music during work periods, and maintained productivity levels that exceeded German industrial output under optimal conditions. Their casual attitudes toward manufacturing processes that represented maximum effort in German industry revealed systematic efficiency rather than desperate wartime measures. The steel mills particularly impressed German prisoners who understood metallurgical production from pre-war civilian employment. American blast furnaces operated continuously without the maintenance shutdowns that plagued German facilities. Raw material deliveries arrived faster than processing capacity could handle them. Quality control produced consistent results without the variations that characterized German steel production, even during peacetime operations. Single American steel plants produced more metal daily than entire German industrial regions achieved at peak efficiency. The scale of operations defied comprehension for prisoners who had worked in European heavy industry. Continuous casting techniques, advanced furnace designs, and automated handling systems demonstrated technological superiority that extended far beyond wartime innovation into fundamental industrial advancement. The automotive industry's conversion to military production provided another demonstration of American industrial flexibility and capacity. Factories that had produced civilian vehicles rapidly retooled to manufacture tanks, aircraft engines, and military equipment without significant delays or quality compromises. The same assembly lines that created family automobiles efficiently produced complex weapon systems using interchangeable techniques and standardized components. German prisoners observed parking lots surrounding these converted facilities filled with workers' personal automobiles, vehicles that represented consumer wealth unimaginable in wartime Germany. Factory employees drove to work in transportation that German officers rarely possessed, treating automobile ownership as routine rather than exceptional privilege. Many workers owned multiple vehicles, using different cars for work commutes and family activities. The River Rouge complex employed over 100,000 workers in a single integrated facility that consumed more electricity daily than major German cities. The scale of operations included steel production, parts manufacturing, and final assembly in coordinated processes that eliminated transportation delays and maximized efficiency. German prisoners had never witnessed industrial integration approaching such comprehensive organization. Shipbuilding facilities demonstrated American capacity to construct complex vessels faster than German yards had ever achieved. Liberty ships emerged from assembly lines with regularity that treated sophisticated marine engineering as routine manufacturing rather than specialized craftsmanship. Each vessel required hundreds of thousands of components produced by suppliers across the continental United States, coordinated through logistics networks that German industry had never approached. The workers constructing these ships included women operating heavy cranes, minorities performing skilled welding, and teenagers managing complex assembly processes. Production schedules maintained delivery rates that exceeded German shipbuilding even during peak wartime efforts. Quality standards ensured that hastily constructed vessels performed reliably in combat conditions while carrying maximum cargo loads across dangerous ocean routes. German prisoners working in American ports witnessed shipping operations that handled more tonnage daily than major European harbors managed weekly. Mechanized loading equipment moved cargo with speed and precision that eliminated delays and reduced labor requirements. Warehousing systems stored massive quantities of materials while maintaining organization that prevented loss or damage. Transportation networks coordinated rail, truck, and ship movements with efficiency that kept goods flowing without bottlenecks or shortages. The psychological impact of witnessing such industrial capacity operating routinely, rather than as desperate wartime measures, fundamentally altered German prisoners' understanding of national power. They had been taught that American industrial strength was temporary mobilization that would collapse under sustained pressure. Instead, they discovered productive capacity that operated comfortably below maximum potential, while supplying global military operations and maintaining civilian prosperity simultaneously. By winter 1944, German prisoners were writing letters home that described American society functioning at levels of efficiency and abundance that made German pre-war prosperity appear primitive by comparison. They documented observations that contradicted every element of Nazi propaganda about American weakness, racial division, and economic instability. Their correspondence revealed men whose fundamental worldview had been reconstructed through direct experience of democratic capitalism operating at full capacity. The camp newspapers published by German prisoners themselves reflected this ideological transformation through articles that discussed post-war reconstruction possibilities rather than maintaining defiant nationalism. Editors who had initially promoted Nazi ideology began exploring democratic governance, free market economics, and individual rights as foundations for Germany's political future. The evolution occurred gradually but consistently, as prisoners gained understanding of how American society actually functioned, rather than how Nazi propaganda had portrayed it. Discussion groups formed spontaneously among prisoners eager to analyze what they had observed and learned during their captivity. Men who had fought to establish Nazi supremacy across Europe now debated constitutional principles, separation of powers, and protection of minority rights as essential elements of stable government. Their conversations revealed genuine intellectual curiosity about democratic institutions, rather than mere adaptation to captivity circumstances. The transformation extended beyond political ideology to encompass economic understanding, social relationships, and cultural appreciation. German prisoners discovered that American strength derived from individual freedom rather than state control, from economic opportunity rather than racial hierarchy, from social cooperation rather than authoritarian domination. These revelations contradicted the fundamental assumptions that had motivated their military service and justified their participation in Nazi aggression. Christmas 1944 provided another demonstration of American generosity that completed the psychological transformation of German prisoners. Despite ongoing combat operations in Europe that were killing American soldiers daily, civilian organizations sent care packages to enemy prisoners with contents that exceeded what German families received from their own government. Local communities invited prisoners to holiday celebrations, though regulations prevented most from accepting such generous relatives were fighting German army's offers. The kindness demonstrated by American civilians, whose revealed a level of human decency that trance groups performed Christmas carols in German for prisoners who had been ended military conflict. Church told that Americans harbored racial hatred toward all Germans. Women's organizations sent homemade cookies and cakes to men whose armies had devastated European cities and murdered civilian populations. This Christian charity toward enemies who had shown no mercy to conquered populations shattered the final remnants of Nazi ideology among German prisoners. They experienced forgiveness from people who had every justification for hatred and revenge. The generosity revealed moral strength that Nazi racial theory had never acknowledged or prepared them to recognize. As 1945 began, German prisoners faced the reality that their homeland was approaching complete military defeat, while they had witnessed the overwhelming power of the nation that would determine Germany's post-war future. Their transformation from Nazi warriors to potential democratic citizens was nearly complete, accomplished not through coercion or propaganda, but through exposure to American society operating at peak efficiency while maintaining human dignity and individual freedom. The revelation that would complete their transformation arrived in April 1945 through footage that American authorities had initially hesitated to show German prisoners. As Allied forces liberated concentration camps across Germany, camera crews documented horrors that exceeded anything these captured soldiers could have imagined. The films were shown in camp theaters, where German prisoners sat in stunned silence, watching systematic murder and industrial-scale brutality that had been conducted in their nation's name. Many prisoners initially refused to believe what they were seeing, claiming the footage was Allied propaganda designed to justify harsh treatment of Germany after the war. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. American soldiers' testimony, detailed photographs, and eventually letters from Germany confirming the discoveries made denial impossible. The psychological impact was devastating for men who had maintained some pride in German military honor despite their defeat. Everything they had fought for was revealed to be not merely misguided, but genuinely evil. The racial theories that had justified their conquest of Europe were exposed as pseudoscientific justification for genocide. The political system they had served was shown to be a criminal enterprise that had systematically murdered millions of innocent civilians while sending German soldiers to die for lies and propaganda. Friedrich Bauer, a former Wehrmacht officer who had been captured in Tunisia, wrote in his diary that the footage destroyed his last connection to the ideology that had shaped his adult life. He had entered the war believing he was defending German civilization against inferior peoples. Now he understood that he had been a tool of criminals who had perverted every value he thought he was protecting. The contrast between Nazi brutality toward helpless victims and American humanity toward enemy prisoners became inescapable. German soldiers who had witnessed mass murder disguised as military necessity now found themselves receiving medical care, educational opportunities, and personal dignity from the very people Nazi propaganda had characterized as subhuman mongrels incapable of civilized behavior. Walter Schmidt, another captured officer, documented his realization that the Americans had shown more respect for German prisoners than the Nazi regime had demonstrated toward its own citizens. He had observed American guards apologizing for minor inconveniences while German SS units had executed civilians for imaginary offenses. The moral inversion was complete and irreversible. By spring 1945, the re-education program had exceeded every expectation American intelligence officers had established. Over 30,000 German prisoners had voluntarily enrolled in courses about democratic governance, constitutional law, and free market economics. The transformation wasn't limited to intellectual understanding, but extended to emotional commitment to rebuilding Germany according to democratic principles. Camp newspapers evolved from publications that maintained vestigial Nazi symbolism to sophisticated journals exploring post-war reconstruction possibilities. German editors interviewed American professors, analyzed democratic institutions, and debated constitutional frameworks that could prevent future authoritarian takeover. The quality of discussion rivaled academic publications produced by established universities. Discussion groups formed throughout the camp system as prisoners eager to understand democratic principles organized themselves into study circles that met voluntarily during recreational hours. Men who had sworn personal loyalty oaths to Adolf Hitler now spent their free time analyzing separation of powers, protection of minority rights, and limitation of government authority as essential elements of civilized society. The intellectual curiosity was genuine rather than calculated adaptation to captivity circumstances. German prisoners requested additional reading materials, correspondence courses, and guest lectures with enthusiasm that surprised American educators who had expected sullen resistance to democratic ideas. They approached learning about freedom with the same systematic thoroughness they had once applied to military training. Some prisoners became so enthusiastic about American political and economic systems that they requested permission to remain in the United States after the war ended. Others established correspondence relationships with American families that would continue for decades, developing friendships that transcended the military conflict that had brought them together as enemies. Marriage proposals between German prisoners and American women occurred frequently enough to require official regulations governing such relationships. The romantic attachments weren't merely opportunistic attempts to avoid repatriation, but reflected genuine emotional connections between people who had discovered common humanity despite their nation's warfare. The agricultural education German prisoners received through work programs provided practical knowledge they planned to implement in post-war reconstruction efforts. American farming methods that achieved yields previously considered impossible in European agriculture offered hope for feeding Germany's population without requiring territorial conquest or slave labor from occupied nations. German farmers among the prisoners documented techniques that could double or triple agricultural production through mechanization, improved seed varieties, and scientific soil management. They learned that American abundance resulted from technological innovation and efficient organization rather than exploitation of conquered territories or forced labor from fugated populations. The subject industrial experience proved equally educational as German processes that achieved quality prisoners witnessed manufacturing and quantity standards far exceeding anything their homeland had accomplished even during peacetime operations. They observed that American productive capacity resulted from worker cooperation and technological advancement rather than authoritarian control and coercive labor practices. German engineers and technicians took detailed notes about assembly line organization, quality control systems, and worker training programs that maximized efficiency while maintaining employee dignity. They understood that post-war German reconstruction would require adopting American methods rather than attempting to restore previous industrial approaches that had proven inadequate for modern competition. The medical knowledge gained through working alongside American healthcare professionals provided another foundation for post-war reconstruction. German doctors learned advanced surgical techniques, pharmaceutical applications, and patient care methods that could save lives and restore health more effectively than traditional European medical practices. The psychological treatment approaches particularly impressed German medical personnel who had never encountered systematic methods for addressing mental trauma and emotional disturbance. They learned that healing human minds required patience and understanding rather than discipline and punishment, knowledge that would prove essential for treating a population traumatized by years of warfare and ideological manipulation. As the war in Europe approached its conclusion, German prisoners faced repatriation with complex emotions that reflected their profound transformation during captivity. They had witnessed American society functioning at levels of efficiency and humanity that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had taught them. They had experienced better treatment as enemy prisoners than many had known as free citizens in their homeland. The prospect of returning to a defeated Germany created anxiety about their ability to implement the democratic principles they had learned during captivity. They understood that their nation faced complete reconstruction of political, economic, and social institutions according to Allied demands rather than German preferences. American authorities provided vocational training, political education, and psychological preparation designed to help former prisoners become productive citizens in a democratic Germany. The programs emphasized practical skills rather than theoretical knowledge, focusing on agriculture, manufacturing, and administration techniques that would be immediately useful in reconstruction efforts. The prisoners learned about the Marshall Plan before its public announcement, understanding that America intended to rebuild rather than punish Germany after achieving military victory. This generosity from victors toward defeated enemies was incomprehensible to minds shaped by Nazi vindictiveness and racial hatred, but it confirmed everything they had observed about American character during their captivity. Between 1945 and 1946, over 370,000 German prisoners were repatriated from American camps to a homeland that had been divided, destroyed, and occupied by Allied forces. They carried with them knowledge of democratic institutions, industrial techniques, and social cooperation that would prove invaluable in Germany's reconstruction. Many former prisoners rose to positions of prominence in West German political, economic, and cultural development during the post-war decades. They brought American methods to German industry, democratic principles to German politics, and humanitarian values to German social policy. Their influence extended far beyond their individual careers to shape an entire generation's approach to governance and international relations. Hans Kroll, who had been held at Camp Shelby, became West Germany's ambassador to the United States, facilitating cooperation between former enemies who had become essential allies. Walter Hallstein, who had attended educational programs at Camp Como, served as president of the European Commission, promoting international integration based on democratic principles he had learned during captivity. Rüdiger von Wechmar, imprisoned at Camp Herne, represented Germany at the United Nations, advocating for peaceful conflict resolution and international law based on humanitarian principles he had witnessed during his imprisonment. Eduard Ackermann, held at Fort Robinson, became a leader in German agricultural reform, implementing American farming methods that increased productivity while improving rural living standards. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany during the 1950s was built partly on knowledge gained in American prisoner of war camps. Former prisoners understood that prosperity resulted from individual freedom rather than state control, from economic competition rather than government planning, from international cooperation rather than nationalist isolation. They had learned that democracy created wealth through protecting individual initiative and rewarding productive effort. They had observed that diversity strengthened society rather than weakening it, that treating workers well increased production rather than reducing it, that openness to criticism improved governance rather than undermining it. The lessons learned as prisoners shaped the new Germany that emerged from Allied occupation as a democratic partner rather than a conquered territory. The transformation from Nazi totalitarianism to liberal democracy was facilitated by men who had experienced both systems and understood the moral and practical superiority of freedom over tyranny. Historians have characterized the German prisoner experience in America as one of the most successful ideological conversion programs in modern history. The achievement was accomplished not through coercion or propaganda, but through exposure to democratic society, functioning efficiently while maintaining human dignity and individual rights. The prisoners were converted through observation rather than indoctrination, through experience rather than argument, through demonstration rather than persuasion. They witnessed American society operating at peak capacity while treating enemies with generosity that contradicted everything they had been taught about democratic weakness and racial hatred. American victory in the propaganda war was achieved not through clever messaging, but through overwhelming evidence of democratic prosperity and humanitarian values in action. Every meal provided to hungry prisoners, every medical treatment given to wounded enemies, every educational opportunity offered to former soldiers was an argument against totalitarian ideology more powerful than any speech or publication. The statistics supporting this assessment are remarkable for their consistency across multiple measures of transformation. Of the 371,000 German prisoners held in America, fewer than 1% attempted escape, with only 2,200 total escape attempts recorded throughout the war. Post-war surveys showed that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Most remarkably, thousands of former prisoners maintained correspondence with American families for decades after the war ended. developing friendships that transcended the military conflict that had initially brought them together as enemies. Many returned to America as tourists, business partners, or immigrants, choosing to build new lives in the nation that had shown them dignity during their darkest hours. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of Germany's surrender, surviving former prisoners organized a reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 men returned to America, many bringing their families to show them the places where their transformation from Nazi warriors to democratic citizens had begun. The reunion featured speeches by former prisoners who had become prominent leaders in post-war Germany, testimonials from American families who had befriended enemy soldiers, and presentations by historians documenting the long-term impact of the prisoner of war experience on German reconstruction and Atlantic cooperation. Hans Weber, who had been held at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and later became a physician in Maine, spoke about discovering human dignity through American treatment that exceeded anything he had experienced as a free citizen in Nazi Germany. He credited his captivity with teaching him that strength came from serving others rather than dominating them, that true power derived from creation rather than destruction. Kurt Meyer, who had worked on Iowa farms during his imprisonment, described learning that prosperity resulted from cooperations rather than conquest, from productivity rather than plunder. He had returned to Germany with agricultural knowledge that helped feed his war-devastated homeland while building friendships with former enemies that lasted throughout his lifetime. At the reunion dinner, Hermann Goetz delivered a keynote address that captured the essence of the transformation these men had experienced. He spoke of arriving in America as believers in Nazi ideology and leaving as advocates for democratic values, of discovering that American strength derived from freedom rather than tyranny, from diversity rather than racial purity, from generosity rather than hatred. He thanked America for showing former enemies a better way to organize society, for demonstrating that nations could prosper through peace rather than war, for proving that former adversaries could become trusted allies through mutual respect and shared values. The audience, consisting of both Americans and Germans, gave him a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. The magnitude of the prisoner of war experience can be measured through statistics that reveal both the scale of the operation and its remarkable success in transforming enemy soldiers into democratic citizens. Over 500 camps operated across 45 states, housing prisoners in facilities that provided better living conditions than many had known as civilians in Germany. The labor contribution exceeded 14 million man-days of agricultural work, 100 million board feet of processed lumber, and over $100 million in economic value measured in 1940s currency. Prisoners filled critical labor shortages in 46 states while learning American methods they would later implement in German Reconstruction. Educational programs enrolled over 40,000 prisoners in courses ranging from basic literacy to university-level instruction. 135 camp newspapers were published, 30,000 prisoners learned English, 15,000 received vocational training, and 8,000 completed university correspondence courses while in captivity. The escape statistics demonstrate the prisoners' acceptance of their treatment and their growing commitment to American values. Only 2,200 escape attempts were recorded from over 370,000 prisoners, a rate of less than 1%. 0 successful permanent escapes occurred, and no American civilians were harmed by escaped prisoners during the entire war. Treatment assessments conducted after repatriation showed that 95% of former prisoners rated their experience as positive. 74% believed captivity had beneficially changed their worldview, and 61% expressed interest in learning more about democratic governance. Less than 10% maintained strong Nazi beliefs by the war's end. Approximately 5,000 former prisoners immigrated to the United States after the war, choosing to make permanent homes in the nation that had treated them with dignity during captivity. Over 12,000 maintained correspondence with American families, with average correspondence duration lasting 31 years. Many returned as tourists or business partners, building economic relationships that strengthened Atlantic cooperation. The German prisoners who experienced American industrial might and democratic values became unwitting ambassadors for freedom, carrying back to their homeland the knowledge and commitment necessary for successful reconstruction. They had witnessed the future of civilization and understood that it required rejecting totalitarian ideology in favor of individual liberty, human dignity, and international cooperation. Their transformation from Nazi warriors to democratic citizens represents one of the most remarkable ideological conversions in human history, accomplished not through force or coercion, but through exposure to a society that practiced the values it proclaimed. They had arrived in America as enemies of freedom and left as its advocates, forever changed by their encounter with the arsenal of democracy, operating at full capacity while maintaining its humanitarian principles. The legacy of their experience extends far beyond individual transformation to encompass the broader reconstruction of German society and the establishment of the Atlantic Alliance that has maintained peace and prosperity in Europe for over 7 decades. Their story demonstrates that even the most committed ideological opponents can be converted through patient demonstration of superior values and generous treatment that appeals to universal human dignity. In the end, America's greatest victory was not achieved on battlefields, but in prisoner of war camps, where overwhelming evidence of democratic prosperity and humanitarian values accomplished what military force alone could never achieve. The complete transformation of enemy minds through the simple but powerful demonstration that free societies create abundance while maintaining human dignity for all. The story doesn't end with their return to Germany. What happened next would prove that these transformed prisoners weren't just carrying memories back home. They were carrying the blueprints for rebuilding an entire civilization. Picture Walter Hallstein stepping off a transport ship in Hamburg, 1946. The city is in ruins, to rubble. Entire blocks have been reduced as children search through debris for scraps of food. The proud Germany these prisoners had left to fight for no longer exists. But Walter isn't seeing destruction. He's seeing opportunity, because he's spent 3 years learning how societies actually function when they prioritize human potential over political control. Walter had been captured with the Afrika Korps, another veteran of Rommel's desert campaigns. During his captivity at Camp Como, he'd attended every political science course the Americans offered. He'd studied constitutional law through University of Chicago correspondence programs. He'd participated in discussion groups that analyzed democratic institutions with the same intensity German officers had once applied to military strategy. Now, standing in the ruins of his homeland, Walter understood something his fellow Germans didn't yet grasp. Germany's future wouldn't be built by trying to restore what had been destroyed. It would be built by implementing what he'd learned about how free societies create prosperity. Within 2 decades, Walter Hallstein would become the first president of the European Commission, architect of the European Union, that would transform a continent of warring nations into an economic powerhouse built on cooperation rather than conquest. The ideas he'd learned as a prisoner of war became the foundation for international institutions that prevented future conflicts through economic integration. But Walter wasn't alone. Across Germany, former prisoners were applying American lessons to German problems with results that would astonish the world. Hans Kroll had worked on wheat farms in Nebraska during his captivity. He'd learned that American farmers achieved yields that German agricultural experts had considered impossible. Single operators using mechanized equipment cultivated areas that required dozens of workers in traditional European farming. The secret wasn't just better machinery, it was better organization, better seeds, better soil management, and better treatment of the workers who made it all possible. When Hans returned to his family farm in Bavaria, he didn't try to restore pre-war methods. He implemented American techniques. Within 5 years, his yields had tripled. His success attracted attention from neighboring farmers who wanted to learn his methods. Hans began teaching agricultural courses that spread American farming techniques across rural Germany. By 1955, West German agricultural productivity had increased by over 200% compared to pre-war levels. The knowledge gained by prisoners working on American farms had been multiplied across thousands of German farming communities. Rural Germans were eating better than they had before the war. Despite losing territory and population to Soviet occupation, the industrial transformation was even more dramatic. Rüdiger von Weckmar had worked at Republic Steel in Ohio during his captivity. He'd witnessed production methods that achieved quality and quantity standards far exceeding anything German industry had accomplished during peacetime. American workers produced more steel per hour than German workers achieved in entire shifts, not through harder labor, but through better systems. When Rüdiger returned to Germany, he found employment with a steel company trying to rebuild from wartime destruction. Instead of attempting to restore old methods, he proposed implementing American production techniques. Management was skeptical. German engineering had always been considered superior to American industrial methods, but the results spoke for themselves. Within 3 years, the plant was producing steel at rates that exceeded pre-war German records. The quality was higher, the costs were lower, and the workers were safer and better paid. Other German companies began adopting similar methods. By the late 1950s, German steel production was competing successfully in global markets using techniques learned by prisoners in American factories. The economic miracle that transformed West Germany during the 1950s wasn't just about American financial aid through the Marshall Plan. It was about former prisoners implementing American methods throughout German industry, agriculture, and administration. They had witnessed how free societies organized themselves for maximum productivity while maintaining worker dignity and individual opportunity. Edward Ackerman had been assigned to a Campbell's soup factory in New Jersey during his captivity. He'd observed automated production lines that processed more food in single days than German facilities handled in months. The key wasn't just machinery. It was systematic organization that eliminated waste while maintaining quality standards that exceeded anything German food processing had achieved. When Eduard returned to Germany, he established food processing companies that employed American methods adapted to German conditions. His facilities achieved productivity levels that German industry had never approached. More importantly, they provided employment for thousands of Germans while producing affordable food for populations struggling with post-war shortages. By 1960, Edwards' companies were exporting German-produced food to international markets, generating foreign currency that helped finance Germany's reconstruction. The knowledge gained from a single prisoner's work assignment had grown into an entire industry that employed tens of thousands of workers. But the transformation went beyond economics into the realm of political culture and social values. Dr. Friedrich Bauer had worked alongside American medical personnel during his captivity. He'd learned that treating patients required viewing them as individuals deserving dignity, rather than cases to be processed efficiently. When Friedrich returned to Germany, he didn't just resume practicing medicine. He helped establish medical schools that taught American approaches to patient care. German doctors learned that healing required understanding patients' emotional and psychological needs, in addition to their physical symptoms. The concept of bedside manner, virtually unknown in German medical training, became standard practice. German hospitals began implementing patient advocacy programs, informed consent procedures, and family involvement in treatment decisions. These innovations, learned from American medical practice, revolutionized German healthcare and contributed to improved outcomes that made German medicine competitive with the best in the world. The political impact was equally profound. Hermann Goetz had participated in civics courses during his captivity that explained how democratic institutions functioned to protect individual rights while maintaining social order. He'd learned that effective government required checks and balances rather than centralized authority, that political opposition strengthened rather than weakened democratic systems. When Hermann returned to Germany, he became involved in local politics, eventually serving in the Bundestag, where he advocated for constitutional protections that would prevent future authoritarian takeover. His understanding of American democratic principles influenced legislation that established West Germany's federal system, protection of minority rights, and limitation of government power. The basic law that became West Germany's constitution incorporated many concepts that former prisoners had learned during their American captivity. The separation of powers, protection of individual liberties, and safeguards against emergency powers all reflected lessons about how democratic institutions actually functioned, rather than theoretical knowledge about political systems. Perhaps most importantly, these former prisoners understood that democracy wasn't just about political structures. It was about cultural attitudes that valued individual initiative, respected diverse perspectives, and resolved conflicts through discussion rather than force. They had witnessed American society functioning according to these principles even under the stress of global warfare. Wilhelm Fischer had worked in Detroit automotive plants during his captivity. He'd observed that American workers weren't just following orders. They were contributing ideas that improved production methods, suggesting modifications that increased efficiency, participating in quality control that prevented defects. Worker input was valued rather than discouraged. When Wilhelm returned to Germany, he established manufacturing companies that implemented American management approaches. German workers were encouraged to contribute suggestions, participate in problem solving, and take responsibility for quality rather than simply following instructions. The results were remarkable improvements in productivity and worker satisfaction. By 1965, German manufacturing was achieving quality standards that exceeded American levels in many industries. The student had surpassed the teacher, but only by first learning the fundamental principles of how to organize human effort for maximum effectiveness while maintaining individual dignity. The educational transformation was equally significant. Otto Krebs had attended lectures on American history and political science during his captivity. He'd learned that education in free societies was designed to develop critical thinking rather than enforce conformity, to encourage questioning rather than demand obedience. When Otto returned to Germany, he became involved in educational reform that transformed German schools from institutions that produced compliant citizens into environments that encouraged independent thought. Students learned to analyze multiple perspectives, debate controversial issues, and form their own judgments based on evidence rather than authority. German universities adopted American approaches to academic freedom, research methodology, and international exchange. Students from around the world came to study in Germany, while German students traveled abroad to gain broader perspectives. The insularity that had characterized German intellectual life was replaced by openness to global ideas and international cooperation. The cultural impact extended to entertainment, arts, and media. German prisoners had watched American films during their captivity that depicted complex characters facing moral dilemmas rather than simple propaganda about good versus evil. They had observed American media presenting multiple viewpoints on controversial issues rather than enforcing single interpretations. When these prisoners returned to Germany, they influenced the development of German cinema, television, and journalism that adopted American standards of artistic freedom and editorial independence. German media became known for objective reporting that presented facts rather than promoting political agendas. German entertainment began exploring universal human themes rather than narrow nationalist concerns. The social transformation was perhaps the most profound. German prisoners had experienced American communities where people from different backgrounds cooperated successfully rather than competing based on ethnic or religious divisions. They had witnessed Americans treating former enemies with dignity rather than seeking revenge for wartime suffering. These lessons influenced the development of West German society that became more tolerant, more inclusive, and more committed to peaceful resolution of conflicts. The authoritarian attitudes that had characterized German social relationships were gradually replaced by democratic values that emphasized mutual respect and individual worth. By 1970, surveys showed that West Germans were among the most committed supporters of democratic values in the world. The transformation from Nazi authoritarianism to liberal democracy had been completed within a single generation, facilitated by men who had learned about freedom through experiencing it as prisoners of war. The international impact extended far beyond Germany's borders, as former prisoners rose to positions of leadership in German government, business, and cultural institutions. They promoted policies that emphasized international cooperation rather than national competition. Germany became an advocate for European integration, Atlantic alliance, and peaceful resolution of global conflicts. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization found some of its strongest German supporters among men who had learned during their captivity that former enemies could become trusted allies through shared values and mutual respect. The European Union developed with German leadership that understood how different nations could cooperate successfully while maintaining their distinct identities. By 1975, Germany had become one of the world's most prosperous democracies, a transformation that astounded observers who remembered the ruins of 1945. The economic miracle was real, but it was built on more than American financial aid. It was built on American ideas implemented by men who had learned through personal experience how free societies actually functioned. The refugee crisis of the 1970s tested German commitment to the humanitarian values that former prisoners had learned during their captivity. When boat people fled Vietnam, Germany welcomed them with the same generosity that Americans had shown to German prisoners 30 years earlier. The lesson about treating former enemies with dignity had become a permanent part of German political culture. Environmental protection became another area where German leadership reflected values learned during American captivity. Former prisoners had observed American conservation efforts that protected natural resources while maintaining economic growth. They understood that prosperity didn't require environmental destruction if societies organized themselves intelligently. By 1980, Germany was leading international efforts to address pollution, preserve wilderness areas, and develop sustainable energy sources. The country that had once pursued conquest through military force was now promoting cooperation through environmental stewardship. The educational exchange programs that connected German and American students reflected relationships that began with former prisoners maintaining correspondence with American families. What started as individual friendships had grown into institutional partnerships that enriched both societies through cultural exchange. German students studying in America learned about diversity, innovation, and individual opportunity. American students studying in Germany learned about social responsibility, environmental consciousness, and historical awareness. The exchange of ideas benefited both nations while strengthening the alliance that had emerged from wartime enmity. The technological cooperation between German and American companies reflected business relationships that former prisoners had established during their return visits to America. German engineering combined with American marketing to produce innovations that served global markets while creating prosperity for workers in both countries. By 1985, the 40th anniversary of Germany's surrender, the transformation was complete and irreversible. Former prisoners had become elder statesmen whose influence extended throughout German society. Their children and grandchildren had grown up in a democratic Germany that valued freedom, protected individual rights, and contributed to international peace. The reunion in Austin, Texas that year brought together over 500 former prisoners who returned to thank America for showing them a better way to organize society. Their testimonials documented one of history's most successful transformations of political culture through peaceful means rather than coercive force. Hans Weber, speaking for his fellow former prisoners, summarized what they had learned and implemented. America had shown them that strength came from serving others rather than dominating them, that prosperity resulted from cooperation rather than conquest, that security was achieved through building trust rather than inspiring fear. They had returned to Germany as missionaries for democracy, not through coercion or propaganda, but through demonstration of superior values in action. They had witnessed the future and understood that it required rejecting authoritarianism in favor of individual liberty, international cooperation, and peaceful resolution of conflicts. The audience at the reunion dinner included American families who had befriended German prisoners, German business leaders who had implemented American methods, and historians documenting the long-term impact of the prisoner experience on German reconstruction and Atlantic cooperation. Kurt Meyer spoke about learning American agricultural techniques that had helped feed post-war Germany while building friendships that lasted decades. He credited his captivity with teaching him that former enemies could become trusted partners through mutual respect and shared commitment to human dignity. Hermann Goetz delivered the keynote address that captured the essence of what these men had accomplished. They had arrived in America as believers in Nazi ideology and left as advocates for democratic values. They had discovered that American power derived from freedom rather than oppression, from diversity rather than uniformity, from generosity rather than hatred. He thanked America for demonstrating that nations could transform enemies into allies through patient example rather than punitive treatment. The lesson had shaped not only individual lives, but entire societies that chose cooperation over conflict as the foundation for lasting prosperity and security. The standing ovation that followed lasted several minutes, a tribute to one of history's most remarkable transformations, accomplished through the simple but powerful demonstration that free societies create abundance while maintaining human dignity for all people, including former enemies. The statistics documenting this transformation tell a story of unprecedented success in converting ideological opponents through exposure to superior values rather than coercive indoctrination. The German prisoner experience in America proved that even the most committed adversaries could become trusted allies through generous treatment that appealed to universal human aspirations for dignity, opportunity, and peace. The legacy continues today as Germany remains one of America's closest allies. A partnership built on foundations laid in prisoner of war camps, where former enemies learned to become friends through shared commitment to democratic values and humanitarian principles. Their story demonstrates that the most powerful weapon in democracy's arsenal isn't military force, but the compelling example of free societies creating prosperity while protecting individual rights. The transformation of German prisoners in America stands as testimony to the possibility of peaceful conversion from authoritarianism to democracy when people are shown rather than told how free societies actually function. It proves that the human desire for dignity and opportunity transcends national boundaries and ideological differences when given the chance to flourish. In the end, these men had witnessed not just American industrial might, but American moral strength. They had experienced not just democratic prosperity, but democratic humanity. And in witnessing and experiencing these truths, they had been transformed from warriors of tyranny into architects of freedom, forever changing the course of history through the power of example rather than force. Their story reminds us that the greatest victories are won not through destroying enemies, but through converting them, not through inspiring fear, but through demonstrating hope, not through conquest, but through cooperation that builds lasting peace based on shared values and mutual respect. The ripple effects of this transformation reached far beyond individual success stories. By the 1990s, something unprecedented was happening in international relations. The children and grandchildren of former German prisoners were working alongside the children and grandchildren of their former American captors, not as reluctant allies, but as genuine partners sharing common values and objectives. Take the case of Michael Hoffman, whose grandfather had been captured at El Alamein and held at Camp Herne. Michael became Germany's representative to NATO, where he worked daily with American officials whose grandfathers might have guarded German prisoners 60 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but it had become natural rather than remarkable. This wasn't just political cooperation, it was cultural fusion at the deepest level. German cities began hosting American-style jazz festivals that celebrated the music former prisoners had first heard over camp loudspeakers. American cities established German Christmas markets that replicated traditions former prisoners had shared with their hosts during wartime holidays. The business relationships that emerged told an even more compelling story. Volkswagen established manufacturing plants in Tennessee, employing thousands of American workers using German engineering methods that had been refined through lessons learned from American industrial practices. The circle was complete. German companies were bringing jobs to American communities using techniques that originated in American factories witnessed by German prisoners 50 years earlier. BMW built manufacturing facilities in South Carolina that became showcases of international cooperation. German managers worked alongside American engineers to create production systems that combined German precision with American efficiency. The result was manufacturing excellence that neither nation could have achieved independently. Meanwhile, American companies established operations throughout Germany, finding a workforce educated in democratic values and trained in industrial methods that emphasized quality and innovation. The economic integration wasn't just beneficial, it was transformative for both societies. The technological cooperation reached into space exploration, where German rocket scientists who had learned democratic principles during American captivity now worked with NASA to explore the cosmos peacefully rather than develop weapons of destruction. The same scientific knowledge that had once been directed toward military conquest was now opening new frontiers for all humanity. Wernher von Braun's story exemplified this transformation. Though he hadn't been a prisoner of war, his integration into American society paralleled the experience of captured soldiers who learned democratic values through exposure rather than coercion. The rocket technology that put Americans on the moon incorporated German engineering guided by humanitarian purposes rather than destructive objectives. Environmental cooperation became another arena where German lessons learned in American captivity bore fruit for global benefit. Former prisoners had observed American conservation efforts that protected natural resources while maintaining economic growth. When environmental challenges emerged in the 1970s and 1980s, German leadership drew on those lessons to pioneer sustainable development approaches. The Black Forest Restoration Project became a model for environmental recovery that combined American technological innovation with German systematic planning. Acid rain damage that had threatened to destroy centuries-old forests was reversed through international cooperation that treated environmental protection as a shared responsibility rather than national burden. German automotive companies led the development of clean diesel technology and hybrid engines, innovations that reduced pollution while maintaining performance standards. The environmental consciousness that former prisoners had observed in American national parks had evolved into industrial applications that benefited consumers worldwide. Educational exchange programs multiplied exponentially as the decades passed. What had begun with individual correspondence between former prisoners and American families grew into institutional partnerships, connecting universities, schools, and research centers across both nations. German students studying in America learned entrepreneurial skills and innovative thinking. American students studying in Germany gained appreciation for social responsibility and historical awareness. The Fulbright program became a highway of intellectual exchange that enriched both societies. German scholars brought systematic research methods and philosophical depth to American universities. American scholars contributed creative problem-solving and interdisciplinary approaches to German institutions. The cross-pollination of ideas accelerated scientific and cultural progress in both nations. By the turn of the 21st century, the transformation had become so complete that younger Germans and Americans often forgot their nations had ever been enemies. The alliance was no longer a strategic necessity, but a natural partnership between peoples who shared fundamental values about human dignity, individual freedom, and peaceful cooperation. The September 11th attacks tested this partnership in ways that revealed its true strength. Germany's immediate support for America wasn't calculated political response, but genuine emotional solidarity. Germans understood that attacks on freedom anywhere threatened freedom everywhere. The lesson learned by prisoners who had witnessed American generosity toward enemies was now being reciprocated by their descendants, who offered assistance to America in its moment of need. German forces served alongside American troops in Afghanistan, not as subordinate allies, but as equal partners in defending democratic values against authoritarian extremism. The sons and grandsons of former prisoners were now fighting alongside the sons and grandsons of former captors against common enemies of human freedom. The intelligence sharing between German and American security services reflected trust that extended far beyond formal agreements. It was based on shared understanding that democratic societies must cooperate to survive in a world where authoritarian movements still threaten individual liberty and human dignity. Cultural cooperation reached new heights with exchange programs that sent American high school students to live with German families and German students to experience American communities. These young people formed friendships that would last lifetimes, creating personal bonds that reinforced official diplomatic relationships. German-American friendship societies flourished in cities across both nations, hosting festivals that celebrated shared values while honoring distinct cultural traditions. Oktoberfest celebrations in American cities drew millions of participants who appreciated German culture without forgetting the historical journey that had made such celebrations possible. The economic partnership continued evolving as German companies invested billions of dollars in American communities, while American corporations established major operations throughout Germany. This wasn't just business. It was the practical expression of trust and mutual benefit that former prisoners had learned was possible between former enemies. Mercedes-Benz built manufacturing facilities in Alabama that became integral parts of local communities. German managers sent their children to American schools, joined local churches, and participated in community organizations. They weren't foreign investors, but neighbors who happened to have been born in different countries. American military bases in Germany evolved from occupation forces to community partners. German communities welcomed American service members as friends, rather than merely tolerating them as strategic necessities. The bases became centers of cultural exchange, where German and American families shared holidays, sports events, and educational programs. The medical cooperation that had begun with German prisoners working alongside American doctors expanded into research partnerships that advanced human knowledge and saved lives globally. German pharmaceutical companies collaborated with American research institutions to develop treatments for diseases that affected people regardless of nationality. Cancer research, cardiovascular medicine, and neurological studies benefited from combined German systematic methodology and American innovative approaches. The results were medical breakthroughs that improved health outcomes for patients worldwide, while demonstrating how international cooperation could address challenges beyond any single nation's capacity. The space program became another symbol of transformation from conflict to cooperation. German engineers and American scientists worked together on projects that explored the cosmos for peaceful purposes. The International Space Station included German-built components that functioned alongside American systems in perfect harmony, a technological metaphor for the broader relationship between the two nations. Today, as we watch Germany and America stand as partners in NATO, as allies in global challenges, as friends sharing technology and culture, we're witnessing the ultimate victory of an idea over ideology. The German prisoners who stepped off those trains in Texas in 1943, expecting to find a weak, divided nation, discovered something that would reshape not just their own lives, but the entire course of human history. They learned that true power doesn't come from conquest, but from creation. That lasting strength isn't built on hatred, but on hope. And that the most devastating weapon in democracy's arsenal isn't a bomb or a bullet, but simply the overwhelming evidence of what free people can achieve when they choose cooperation over conflict. The transformation of nearly 400,000 enemy soldiers into advocates for freedom proved something remarkable: that even the most committed opponents can become the closest allies when shown the power of human dignity in action.